the squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the sharp tang of iodine masking older, rusted smells. Rachel hated the ER because it felt like a failed triage in Helmond, just with better lighting. She was supposed to be taking vitals. Instead, she was calculating the kill angles in room 4. The clock above the nurse's station read 3:14 a.m. The numbers buzzed with a faint, high-frequency whine that most people couldn't hear. Rachel could. It vibrated right behind her molars, carrying the exact same pitch as the avionics in a Black Hawk. She pressed the heel of her hand against her temple, staring at the glowing screen of the patient database. Her eyes burned. The air in the emergency room was stagnant, heavy with the smell of industrial floor wax, stale Folgers coffee, and the faint, sour tang of unwashed bodies. "I swear, if one more drunk comes in here puking cheap tequila, I'm quitting," Chloe muttered. The older nurse leaned against the counter, aggressively massaging her arches through her thick orthopedic shoes. "You doing okay, rookie? You look a little green." "Just tired," Rachel said. Her voice was flat, practiced. She fumbled intentionally with a stack of discharge papers, letting one slip to the floor. She bent to pick it up, making a show of being clumsy. It was easier this way. If they thought she was just Rachel, the anxious 26-year-old nursing school grad who couldn't find a vein on the first try, they didn't ask questions. They didn't wonder why she never talked about her 20s. They didn't look at the thick, pale scar climbing up her collarbone and ask how she got it. And most importantly, they didn't expect anything from her under pressure. Dr. Miller strode past, a crumpled white coat flapping around his knees. "Cole, stop daydreaming. Go restock the trauma cart in Bay 2. You forgot the large-bore IVs again." "Sorry, Dr. Miller," Rachel squeaked, pitching her voice slightly higher than its natural timbre. "Doing it now." She turned toward the supply closet, her shoulders slumped in an exaggerated posture of defeat. In reality, her muscles were coiled so tight they ached. The transition to civilian life was supposed to be a decompression, a return to normalcy. Instead, it felt like holding her breath underwater. The ER was chaotic, but it was a soft, predictable chaos. People got hurt, they came here, they got fixed, or they died. There was no malice in it, just bad luck and bad choices, until the double doors of the ambulance bay blew open. The crash of metal against the magnetic door stops echoed like a mortar shell. 2 paramedics sprinted backward, dragging a gurney. "Male, mid-20s, multiple GSWs to the abdomen and left thigh," the lead paramedic yelled, his voice cracking. "BP is 80/40 and dropping. We lost his airway 2 minutes out." The sluggish rhythm of the ER instantly snapped. Chloe dropped her shoe. Dr. Miller spun around, barking orders. "Bay 1, get respiratory down here now. Cole, get the shears. Cut him out of that shirt." Rachel moved. She didn't sprint. She glided. It was an old habit she had to consciously suppress, forcing herself to stumble slightly over the threshold of Trauma Bay 1 to maintain her cover. The air in the room immediately thickened with the heavy metallic stench of iron and the distinct sulphurous odor of voided bowels. The patient was thrashing weakly, his skin the color of wet ash. Rachel grabbed the heavy trauma shears. Her hands, which usually shook when she tried to type in passwords or hold a coffee cup, were suddenly dead still. The violent tremor that plagued her civilian days vanished the second she smelled ruptured organs. She hated herself for it. She sliced through the man's heavy denim jacket and blood-soaked T-shirt. As the fabric fell away, a heavy, cold dread settled in her stomach. The wounds weren't from a chaotic drive-by. They were tight, grouped tightly together. Center mass. Controlled pairs. This wasn't a gangbanger holding a pistol sideways. This was professional work. "Hold pressure," Miller yelled, plunging his gloved hands into the mess of the patient's abdomen. Rachel leaned her weight onto the wadded gauze. As she did, she glanced up through the glass walls of the trauma bay, looking past the nurse's station and toward the main waiting room doors. 2 men had just walked in. They weren't moving like frantic relatives. They moved like hunters. They were taking slow, deliberate steps, their eyes scanning the corners of the room, reading the sight lines. It was July, unseasonably hot, yet both wore heavy, dark windbreakers zipped halfway up. Rachel's heart rate plummeted to a calm, rhythmic 60 beats per minute. The ambient noise of the room, Miller shouting, the erratic beep of the heart monitor, Chloe crying out for a bag valve mask, receded into a dull, manageable hum. She watched the taller of the 2 men shift his weight. His right hand rested deep in his jacket pocket. The fabric pulled tight against a hard, L-shaped print. No. Rachel thought, closing her eyes for a fraction of a second. Not my problem. I fix people now. I don't break them. She looked down at the dying man under her hands. He had a crude tattoo on his neck. A snake wrapped around a dagger. Local cartel affiliate. The 2 men outside weren't here to check on him. They were the cleanup crew. Through the glass, Rachel watched Todd, the overnight security guard, approach the 2 men. Todd was a 50-year-old retired municipal worker whose primary combat experience consisted of arguing with teenagers skateboarding in the parking lot. He unclipped his radio, holding up a hand to stop them. Rachel's grip on the bloody gauze tightened. Turn around, Todd. Just go back to the desk. The shorter man didn't even break stride. He stepped into Todd's personal space. There was a flash of movement, a short, brutal, upward thrust. Todd didn't scream. He just crumpled. He hit the linoleum with a sickening, wet slap, a heavy bag of meat suddenly devoid of tension. The shorter man stepped over him, pulling a suppressed pistol from his waistband. "They're inside," Rachel said. Her voice was so low, so devoid of panic, that Dr. Miller didn't even look up from the patient's blown-out artery. "What, Cole? I said more pressure." Thwack! The sound was underwhelming. It wasn't a cinematic bang. It sounded like a heavy staple gun driving into thick wood. The reinforced glass of the trauma bay shattered into a million opaque spider webs. A nurse at the central station shrieked, a high, tearing sound that finally broke the hospital's oblivious trance. "Get down!" Rachel grabbed Dr. Miller by the collar of his scrubs and ripped him backward. He weighed 200 pounds, but she hauled him off his feet, throwing him behind the heavy steel base of the surgical table. Chloe froze, her mouth open in an O of sheer terror, clutching a bag of saline. Rachel lunged, tackling the older woman to the sticky floor just as a second suppressed shot punched a neat hole through the wall exactly where Chloe's head had been. Drywall dust rained down on them, tasting like chalk and old insulation. "What is happening?" Miller gasped, crawling backward into a puddle of the patient's blood. "Who is shooting?" Rachel didn't answer. She was doing the math. 2 shooters, suppressed weapons. They knew where the target was, which meant they had a spotter outside or had followed the ambulance. The trauma bay had 1 entrance. The walls were standard hospital construction, 2 sheets of drywall over metal studs. Not bulletproof. The only hard cover was the surgical table and the heavy, lead-lined portable X-ray machine pushed against the far wall. She huddled on the floor next to Chloe, whose chest was heaving with hyperventilation. The smell of Chloe's cheap vanilla perfume mixed with the copper tang of the room. Rachel felt the familiar, ugly itch crawling up her spine. The instinct to act, to dominate the space. She fought it. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her forehead against the cool, slick tiles. "I'm a nurse. I'm a rookie. I hide. I wait for the cops. But the cops were at least 8 minutes away. The gunmen were 20 feet away. Heavy boots crunched over shattered glass. They were moving tactically. One covering, one advancing. They're coming for him. Rachel whispered, looking at the patient on the table, who was now bleeding out rapidly without Miller's pressure. She looked at Chloe. The woman was sobbing, paralyzed by the kind of primal fear that turns humans into prey. If the shooters came into the bay, they wouldn't just execute the cartel kid. They would neutralize the witnesses. Miller and Chloe were dead if they stayed on the floor. Rachel exhaled, a long, slow breath that shuddered out of her lungs. The civilian shell cracked, and the violent machinery beneath ground into gear. She let go of Chloe's arm. "Stay down," Rachel murmured. She crawled on her belly, ignoring the blood soaking through her scrubs, moving toward the overturned trauma cart. She didn't reach for the defibrillator paddles. She wasn't in a movie. She bypassed the heavy medical equipment and grabbed a large steel D-cylinder of oxygen. It weighed about 14 pounds. She positioned herself pressed flat against the wall, right beside the doorway, completely out of the line of sight from the hall. The squeak of rubber soles grew louder. The breathing of the man approaching was slow, controlled. He was good. But he wasn't a SEAL. He didn't know how to clear a threshold without exposing his weapon first. The black cylinder of a suppressor breached the doorframe, then a gloved hand, then a shoulder wrapped in dark nylon. Rachel didn't hesitate. She didn't yell. She swung the oxygen tank like a baseball bat, putting her hips, her core, and years of specialized close-quarters combat training into the arc. The heavy steel cylinder connected with the side of the gunman's skull. The impact sounded like a dropped melon. The man didn't cry out. His brain just instantly shut down. He pitched forward, his dead weight crashing into the metal trash can, his pistol skittering across the bloody tiles. Rachel dropped the tank. It was too clumsy for what came next. Before the first body even settled, the second shooter rounded the corner, his eyes wide, swinging his weapon toward the noise. Rachel didn't retreat. She lunged forward, closing the distance before he could get the barrel online. She slapped the hot suppressor upward with her left forearm, taking a blistering burn through her sleeve, and drove her right palm directly into the cartilage of his nose. He grunted, a wet, ugly sound, and stumbled backward into the hallway. He was huge. Easily 250 pounds of dense muscle. He recovered faster than she expected, dropping his compromised pistol and grabbing her by the throat. His hands were like meat hooks. He slammed her backward into the doorframe. The breath exploded from Rachel's lungs. Pain flared white-hot across her ribs. The hospital light spun above her. He smelled of stale cigarettes, old sweat, and cheap peppermint gum. His grip tightened, crushing her windpipe. "Stupid bitch!" He snarled, his eyes watering from the broken nose, but his face twisted in rage. He reached behind his back with his free hand, pulling a fixed-blade knife from his belt. Rachel was out of practice. Her shoulder burned where she had torn a rotator cuff 3 years ago in Syria. She was losing oxygen fast, black spots dancing in her peripheral vision. She didn't try to pull his hands off her neck. Instead, her right hand blindly swept the tray on the wall beside her. Her fingers closed around a pair of heavy, stainless steel trauma shears. As the man brought the knife up to gut her, Rachel drove the sharp, angled tip of the shears forward. She didn't aim for his chest. She aimed for the soft, vulnerable pocket just above his collarbone, the exact spot where her own scar lay. The shears sank deep, biting through skin, muscle, and the subclavian artery. The man's eyes widened in shock. His grip on her throat loosened instantly. He dropped the knife, his hands flying to his neck as a high-pressure geyser of bright, arterial blood sprayed across Rachel's face, painting the white walls of the hallway crimson. He stumbled back, making a horrific, gurgling sound, slipping on the slick floor. He fell hard, his legs kicking out in rapid, dying spasms. Rachel slid down the wall, gasping for air, her throat bruised and throbbing. She wiped the sticky heat from her eyes with a trembling hand. She looked down at her hands. They were soaked. From inside the room, Dr. Miller slowly raised his head over the surgical table. He looked at the two dead men. He looked at the massive pools of blood expanding across the linoleum. Then he looked at Rachel, the clumsy, quiet rookie, sitting perfectly still amidst the carnage. "Cole!" Miller whispered, his voice trembling so hard it cracked. What did you do?" Rachel stared at the bodies. The adrenaline was receding, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion. She closed her eyes. "I restocked the trauma cart, Doctor." The police arrived in a chaotic swarm of blue strobes and static-laced radio chatter, shattering whatever fragile silence had settled over the trauma bay. Rachel sat on a plastic waiting room chair, a foil thermal blanket draped over her shaking shoulders. The shaking was real, though not entirely from fear. It was the adrenal crash, the violent pendulum swing of a body returning to baseline after preparing for death. Her hands were tucked beneath the foil, wrapped in sterile gauze where the suppressor had blistered her skin. A heavy metallic tang still hung in the air, competing with the sharp, chemical bite of bleach as a hazmat crew hovered at the edge of the perimeter. Detective Hackett sidestepped a yellow evidence marker and stopped in front of her. He was a tired-looking man in a rumpled suit that smelled faintly of stale diner coffee and damp wool. He held a small notepad, clicking a pen with rhythmic, annoying precision. "You're Rachel," Hackett said. It wasn't a question. He pulled up a rolling stool and sat, putting himself at her eye level. "Dr. Miller says you saved his life, says you incapacitated the shooters." Rachel kept her eyes on the scuffed toes of her nursing shoes. "I panicked. I just grabbed the oxygen tank and swung." "Right." Hackett stopped clicking the pen. "You swung a 14-pound cylinder, cracked a man's skull, then managed to disarm a second man, who outweighed you by 100 pounds, and sever his subclavian artery with medical shears." He leaned closer. The smell of peppermint and old sweat from the dead man still clung to Rachel's scrubs, turning her stomach. "That's a hell of a panic response, Rachel," Hackett murmured. "Most people freeze. Some run. Very few execute a textbook close-quarters counter-ambush." Rachel looked up. She let a tear spill over her lower lash line, a calculated display of vulnerability. "I don't know what you want me to say. He was going to kill Dr. Miller. He was going to kill Chloe. I just reacted." Hackett stared at her, his eyes stripping away the oversized scrubs, the messy bun, the foil blanket. He was looking for the operator beneath the disguise. "We ran your prints, the ones we got off the oxygen tank. Department of Defense flagged them. Classified clearance. No unit attached. No discharge papers in the public file. You want to tell me what a ghost is doing taking blood pressure in my city?" She opened her mouth to feed him the rehearsed lie about clerical errors and a brief stint in logistics, but a sharp, high-pitched squawk from Hackett's radio cut her off. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 at the south perimeter. We have 4 black SUVs pushing past the barricades, heavily armed." Gunfire erupted through the radio speaker, a chaotic, staccato burst of automatic rifles. Hackett cursed, leaping off the stool. "All units, we have a breach. Lock down the ER." Rachel threw off the thermal blanket. The cold air hit her sweat-dampened scrubs. The cartel wasn't cutting their losses. The kid on the table must have been someone incredibly important, a boss's son, a lieutenant holding vital keys, because you didn't assault a hospital with a full hit squad unless the stakes were existential. "Hey!" Hackett yelled as Rachel moved past him. "Get back down! You're a civilian!" "Not tonight," Rachel said. She walked over to the evidence table where an officer had carelessly placed the first shooter's suppressed pistol. She grabbed it, dropping the magazine into her palm to check the weight, then slapped it back in. The familiar weight of the polymer grip settled into her hand, cold and reassuring. It was a miserable, cynical realization. She was more comfortable holding a loaded weapon than a stethoscope. The main power grid died. A heavy, suffocating darkness instantly swallowed the emergency room. 2 seconds later, the backup generators kicked in with a low, vibrating hum, bathing the corridors in a sickly, dim yellow light. Shadows stretched and distorted across the linoleum. "Listen to me," Rachel said, grabbing Hackett by the lapels of his cheap suit, forcing him to focus. "They aren't here for a shootout. They are here for a wipe. They will clear room by room and kill everyone who saw those 2 men die. You have 6 uniformed cops out there with handguns. They have rifles." Hackett swallowed hard. "SWAT is 10 minutes out. We don't have 10 minutes. Rachel turned to Miller and Chloe, who were huddled behind the reception desk, clutching each other. "Take the maintenance stairwell. Go to the MRI wing. The magnets will mess with their comms, and the doors are reinforced steel. Lock it from the inside, and do not open it for anyone." "What about you?" Chloe sobbed, mascara running down her pale cheeks. Rachel racked the slide of the pistol, chambering around. The metallic clack was unnervingly loud. "I'm going to triage." The eastern corridor was utterly silent. The yellow emergency lights flickered, casting long, wavering shadows. Rachel pressed her back against the cool plaster of the wall, controlling her breathing. In for 4. Hold for 4. Out for 4. She heard the crunch of shattered glass from the lobby. Heavy, synchronized footsteps. 3 men, moving in a tight wedge formation. They were sweeping the rooms, systematic and brutal. Rachel slid down to a crouch, her bad shoulder throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache. She didn't feel heroic. She felt old. Every joint protested, her lungs burned. She had spent the last 3 years trying to scrub the violence out of her soul, attending group therapy, learning to bake sourdough, forcing herself to smile at coffee shop baristas. It took exactly 4 minutes to tear all that down. A beam from a weapon-mounted flashlight swept across the floor, 10 feet ahead of her. She waited until the light passed, then stepped out from cover. She didn't aim down the sights. The distance was too short, the lighting too poor. She relied on muscle memory, point shooting with a cold, mechanical rhythm. Pop, pop. The suppressed pistol jumped in her hands. The lead man in the wedge dropped instantly, his body armor useless against rounds placed perfectly in the unprotected triangle of his face. The other 2 reacted violently, their unsuppressed rifles roaring in the confined space. Drywall exploded around Rachel in clouds of white dust. Chunks of plaster stung her face like angry hornets. She threw herself sideways, diving through the open door of a supply closet as bullets chewed the door frame to splinters. A jagged piece of a shattered IV pole sliced across her calf as she landed. She bit down on her lip hard enough to taste copper, swallowing the scream. "Suppressing!" one of the men yelled in Spanish. The gunfire became a continuous, deafening roar. Rachel scrambled backward, pressing herself behind a towering stack of saline boxes. They were only water, but enough dense liquid could slow a round. She checked her magazine. 9 rounds left. The gunfire stopped. The ringing in her ears was a high, agonizing screech. "Clear the room," a deep voice commanded from the hallway. A flashbang grenade bounced through the doorway, skittering across the floor. Rachel squeezed her eyes shut, tucked her head between her knees, and covered her ears. The detonation was absolute physical trauma. The shockwave punched the breath from her lungs, rattling her teeth. A brilliant, searing white light burned through her closed eyelids. Before the echo even faded, the doorway darkened as a massive figure breached the room. Rachel didn't try to shoot. Her vision was blurred with floating purple spots, her equilibrium completely shattered. Instead, she kicked outward, driving the heel of her shoe directly into the man's kneecap. Cartilage snapped with a sickening pop. The man screamed, a wet, guttural sound, and collapsed forward. Rachel rolled, ignoring the screaming pain in her calf, and brought her pistol up, firing twice into his chest as he fell. He crashed into the shelving unit, bringing a cascade of heavy medical supplies down on top of them. The third man was still in the hall. He blindly sprayed a burst of automatic fire through the drywall, hoping to catch her in the ricochet. A bullet grazed her left bicep, a hot, searing whip of agony that left a trench of burned flesh in its wake. Rachel grunted, dropping the empty pistol. It was useless now. She crawled through the debris of the closet, her hands desperately searching the spilled supplies in the dim light. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, rigid plastic box, the portable defibrillator. The firing stopped. The last man was reloading. She could hear the distinct metallic scrape of an empty magazine hitting the floor, followed by the clatter of a fresh one being seated. Rachel ripped the defibrillator from its mount, ripping the adhesive pads free. She didn't have time to power it up properly. She jammed the manual override, the machine whining as the capacitors instantly flooded with maximum joules. The man stepped into the doorway, his rifle raised, sweeping the corners. Rachel launched herself from the floor. She didn't go for his weapon. She slammed both adhesive pads directly onto his wet, sweat-soaked neck, right above the collar of his tactical vest, and hit the shock button. The electrical discharge was terrifying. The man's body seized violently, every muscle locking in a state of absolute, agonizing rigidity. His eyes rolled back into his head. The rifle discharged harmlessly into the ceiling, the recoil tearing the weapon from his paralyzed hands. Rachel held the pads against him until the machine cycled down, then shoved his rigid, smoking body backward into the hallway. He hit the floor and didn't move. She stood there in the doorway, chest heaving, blood dripping steadily from her grazed bicep and her sliced calf. The smell of ozone, burnt hair, and cordite was overpowering. Down the hall, the heavy steel doors of the emergency entrance burst open. Flashlights cut through the darkness, painting the smoke-filled air in harsh, intersecting beams. "Police! Drop your weapons! Show me your hands!" Rachel looked at the carnage around her. The walls were pockmarked with bullet holes. The floor was a slick, dangerous mess of saline, blood, and plaster dust. She slowly raised her empty hands, wincing as her shoulder screamed in protest. Hackett pushed his way through the line of SWAT officers. He lowered his flashlight when he saw her. He looked at the 3 bodies scattered outside the closet, then at Rachel, leaning against the doorframe, looking like a battered, exhausted ghost. "Area secure," Hackett barked to the officers, though his eyes never left Rachel. He walked up to her, stepping carefully over the debris. "You okay, rookie?" he asked, his voice low, lacking any of its previous sarcasm. Rachel let out a shaky, breathless laugh. She looked down at her blood-stained scrubs, at the ruin of her carefully constructed civilian life. She could never go back to fumbling with discharge papers. They would know. They would always look at her and see the monster hiding in the scrubs. "I think," Rachel whispered, pressing a clean piece of gauze against her bleeding arm. "I'm going to need a new job. If Rachel's brutal shift kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you intense, pulse-pounding stories every single week, dropping you right into the heart of the action. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and sound off in the comments. What would you do if you found out your quiet co-worker was a deadly operator? Turn on notifications so you never miss a mission.